it's fascinating to me how the inner critic always is like, here I go again when we do or are about to do something negative, but it never says, here I go again when we do something positive, right? And it's like, that's another thing. It's like, here I go again, going for a walk. Nice. Here I go again, choosing fruit over something. Here I go again, I'm thanking someone. Like there's a million, like we don't do that, but it's interesting when you practice that, you appreciate it, you become friends with it. I love the here I go again, because I think for a lot of people, it's that voice. It's like they intend to not eat after dinner one night, then they eat after dinner, then it's here I go again, and they ate whatever it was, but then it's the whole judgment, the whole self-talk afterward that puts them on a downward spiral.
Right.
And that's, to your point, what we want to be careful of is that, that second thought. And just, maybe one of the easier ways to practice more self-compassion, and these all go hand in hand, is to separate facts from fiction. Like the fact is, let's say you ate after dinner. The fiction is everything else you're telling yourself. That's your own personal narrative. That's your own story you're telling yourself. Focus on the facts. You ate. All right, big deal. Next, we move on.
Today, I want to welcome a special guest to the show, George Costanza. You know him, right?
Love George.
Yeah, man, he's hilarious. He's also really obnoxious.
He's obnoxious to other people, and he's obnoxious to himself as well.
Yeah. Would we call him critical?
Very.
Yeah. So today I don't have Jason Alexander here. I lied. But now that I have you, let's talk about the inner critic, right?
Good segue. And this is not a Seinfeld deep dive. We will talk about Costanza and all that good stuff, but we're not going to do a deep dive in Seinfeld.
No, but it's good to kind of have like another image I'll just go ahead and put out there, because maybe George Costanza doesn't fit. Like, I don't necessarily hear George Costanza in my head. I tend to think about like Everybody Loves Raymond's mother. I'm blanking on her name, but Doris was the actress. Marie Barone, right? Like everything was like, oh, don't do that. Oh, did you think about that? Okay, enough. So that's what we're talking about today. And the first thing I think we should talk about is, what the heck is it? Like, what are we talking about? The inner critic, Adam?
Yeah, I'm gonna answer a question with a question. You tell me.
Oh, that's the question.
Yeah. You tell me what is the purpose of the inner critic?
Okay, the inner critic actually is meant to keep us alive, which sounds crazy because I think in this day and age, a lot of us realize the inner critic can cause a lot of problems. I think, in fact, sometimes we end up kind of putting ourselves in a pickle. Whereas way back when we definitely had to be able to like size up like a peak that was up ahead, or a storm, or a big beast we had never encountered before. We needed that ability to really critique the moment, right? Critique the adversary, critique whatever it was that was going to threaten our life. I feel very fortunate we don't have to do that now. Did that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. So what you're saying, it was and is, although it's no longer serving us all that much anymore, a survival mechanism.
Yes, that is what I'm saying. And listen, I'm not saying it's all good or all bad, right? Like, I want to be really clear. Critics have their place, especially our inner critics. They do a lot of good for us, and we're going to get to that a little bit later on in our discussion. But for now, ultimately, the whole point of it was, let's stay alive, and here's how we're going to do it. We're going to pick everything apart and make sure we know what we're facing.
Good. I like it.
Cool. So how do we figure out what our inner critic is, or like, how do we find it? How do we identify it? What do you think about that?
I like to think of it as like waves in an ocean. It's like, we all have our thoughts. And I think you can kind of combine inner critic with just inner voice, right? We all have an inner voice, and sometimes it happens to be critical, and sometimes it doesn't serve us well at all, right? So we have this inner voice, we have thoughts, and we want to ideally, instead of like, let's imagine the waves are the thoughts or critical voice. We don't want to be the waves themselves. We want to imagine ourselves riding the waves, surfing the waves, enjoying the waves. But we don't want to be the waves themselves, because if you're the waves themselves, if you are your thoughts or your critical voice, then you can't separate yourself from that. And that's when we start to believe our thoughts, or we start to believe that voice.
Yeah, I really like that visualization. I think a lot of people really appreciate kind of having a tangible image that they can use, right, to sort that out. I love that. So the inner critic actually, or the inner voice, is the waves, but don't become the waves. Surf the waves.
Yes.
Cool. I love to also tell my clients, like, notice your first thoughts. That's your inner critic. The first thought is almost always the inner critic, right? And choose your second thought.
Love that.
Right? We can't choose our first thought. That's not how brains work. It's not how inner critics work, right? Or we'd all be dead. So yeah, notice your first thought. That's your inner critic. Choose your second thought. That's kind of how I help people figure it out. And I think, I have a client that I'm working with recently. Gosh, she's working so hard and doing such a great job. But what we're realizing is there is a strong inner critic. That first thought is powerful. And the habit has been to definitely be the waves for her. But what we're really working on now is when she makes a choice that may not be what she expected or what she had planned, it's like, all right, listen, first of all, we'll sort that out. But just notice, what was that first thought? What did the inner critic say? Because the habit has been to just follow the fold with that inner critic and just, burn herself to the ground. And we're trying to change that. So we're working on choosing the second thought.
I love that. That's really, really powerful stuff.
Yeah, I like that too, because I think that it is powerful, right? It's empowering to think, oh, but I do have a choice about which thoughts I want to have. Maybe not the first one, but I can choose the second one.
Although I will say, just to go on a mini tangent, one of the best ways to control your thoughts, or at least to influence your thoughts, is to control your input. Right. And, I think we often, think how, our thoughts just come and go. But if if you're listening to positive people, if you're reading positive things, if you're watching positive things, you're going to likely have more positive thoughts. Right. Whereas, when I'm watching a Dateline, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, someone's going to, kill me or whatever. Like that's not coincidental. Right. That's like, there's a reason for that. I'm watching stuff that is putting me, heightening anxieties, etc. Right? So
yes,
you can always control your input. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, I literally just had that conversation with a client. She was saying to me, like, we were talking about giving her an extra rest day in her week. She was working out 6 days a week, which amazing. But I was like, you're not being paid millions of dollars to run a football up and down the field. Let's be realistic here. Like 6 days a week of intense exercise is a lot. And she goes, well, it's just really hard when you look on social media and they're like, no rest days. And I'm like, yeah, you're just seeing the Instagram version of their life, right? Like that does not look good in real life. And I said, just be really careful, because we're working really hard on our end to help you manage your thoughts and feelings. And so be careful of those inputs. We kind of went on a tangent here. I do want to say something though, that I want to know your thoughts on this, Adam, because it's interesting. So what I wrote here in my notes, these first thoughts, this inner critic, is initially meant to help us find alignment with the ideal. But what this critic ends up doing is sabotaging us and snuffing out our unique individualism. Do I need to repeat it?
Please. That's some good stuff. Okay. A lot to unpack. Let's say it again.
Okay. These first thoughts, or the inner critic, is initially meant to help us find alignment with the ideal. Think of it in today's context, okay? But what this critic ends up doing is sabotaging us and snuffing out our unique individualism.
So the first part of it is, the way I interpret that is, our ideal to me is like our values, what we want, what we aspire to, our intentions. Not our intentions, but what we want for ourselves.
Hmm.
And then it's like if we go against those desires, that's when all the negative feelings come about. Am I
Hmm.
interpreting it?
Yes. So, like, I'll give you an example and maybe it'll help clarify my statement because now that I'm reading it back, it's awful wordy. Um, so, what I think I meant was like, let's just say, okay, we get a client who says they want to become, an elite athlete. All right, fine. So, they might look at what elite athletes do to get there. And then they try to cram themselves into a box because, well, the critic said those unique athletes work out 6 days a week and you're only working out 5 days a week. Or the critic says those elite athletes eat this certain balance of macros or this number of calories or sleeps this amount every night and you're doing it this way. Right. So I think sometimes that critic, in an effort to help us survive and achieve and become, tries to shove us into a box so we look like everybody else, which to the brain says, well, that's guaranteed survival. That's guaranteed success, right? But then in the end, it ends up snuffing out our individuality. So that's kind of what I meant by that statement. A little heady.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the point is listen, like, I think we have to find a balance, right? Between honoring that there is an inner critic and it's trying to do some good stuff for us, trying to help us, and that it's also okay to kind of find our own path and not rail against the critic, but realize like the critic isn't always right.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
So, that being said, how do we quiet the critic?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of my favorite things to do and encourage others to do is, I think that critic unfortunately doesn't need to be awakened. It's always there for many of us. Is to use it as a trigger to, let's say you have, negative self-talk or this critic is, making itself heard. Immediately counter it with 2 to 3 positive things. And at first it feels weird, it feels forced, it feels hokey, whatever. But when you do it enough, eventually the inner or the negative self-talk you have becomes a trigger for positive self-talk, and it becomes habitual eventually, which is ideal, right? So that's one thing I've encouraged people to try doing is whenever you feel yourself talking bad about yourself, immediately counter with 3 positives.
Yeah, I like that. And it trains them to see more than just what the brain is telling them to see, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
How about
I
you?
think too, like, well, I do the first thought, like, hey, recognize your first thought. What's the critic saying? And then, I actually slot in appreciation in there because that immediately flips somebody into self-compassion.
Yeah.
Like, we don't want to snuff out the critic. The critic is there for many important reasons. And I think everything just flows a lot better when you just appreciate the critic. So I will say, like, notice your first thought. What's the critic saying? Can you thank the critic for their input? And then slow down and maybe choose a second or a third thought. So it's similar to what you're doing. But I do think appreciation is important because anytime we resist something or turn away from something, that's when it kind of comes at us. So that's how I work on quieting the critic, and also making sure there's actually space for it to remain and exist, right? Because we're not going to get rid of it anytime soon.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of like, like if someone's like, well, no matter what, like I'm just always so harsh on myself. It's perhaps that's from childhood, perhaps that's from conditioning. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons, but I think, as you said, it's very hard to control that first thought. But yeah, it's that second thought, that second, action you take after that first critical thought that makes all the difference.
Yeah.
Something I think a lot about is like, would you be friends with your critic, right? Would you be friends with that inner voice? And I think for many of us, we probably wouldn't be friends with that person. And it's like, talk to yourself how you would talk to others. Talk to yourself how you would talk to a child. And I think that helps to give ourselves some more grace and more self-compassion. because it's so easy to beat ourselves up, but you wouldn't beat your best friend or a child or a loved one, but yet for ourselves we often do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that too. And I think the things we're pointing out is like we have to figure out how to create a space for that self-compassion, right? That grace. And that's how we grow the other side of the critic, which is choice, which is actually choosing how we're going to treat ourselves. So I think that is a crucial component. Um, and then, I did want to make one more mention. Like, what do you think about, like, what if somebody says to you, gosh, I just feel like I'm hypercritical of myself all the time? I sort of had the thought that it probably meant they were just living in like a really rigid version of things, right? Like there are just so many walls and cages and like limitations um, in an effort to keep them safe, right? And ensure survival. And that's when I find a lot of people have a really strong inner critic. What do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think for some people, discipline is freedom. So it's like they have all these rules, all these goals, etc. But then when they don't meet them, that's when they kind of fall apart because they're just so hard on themselves. So yeah, perhaps
Yeah.
it's a sign that maybe lower your expectations or your intentions a little bit so you can meet them. But also part of the work is when you inevitably don't do exactly what you set out to do, because sometimes life happens, you practice self-compassion. And self-compassion is a skill, right? And yeah, I think that's yeah. I mean, perhaps it is, to your point, lowering, kind of loosening up the guidelines or guardrails, so to speak. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's the way, and that's going to feel weird and awkward, and you may find things getting messy, but yeah, it's sort of like practice what you're not good at, right? Like I think that's where really a lot of us stand to benefit from growth. So yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to put that out there because I was thinking like, well, how come some people's critic is louder than others? And I really do think it stems from that really high expectations of oneself, living with a lot of discipline, probably maybe excess discipline. So
Yeah.
just something to ponder.
And one other thought is just one way to practice being more self-compassionate and less judgmental of yourself is to be less judgmental of other people. And it's so, for some people it's so easy to immediately think negatively if something, oh, he or she did this again, or here we like. Try to give people self-compassion and the benefit of the doubt, and being less critical of them. And when you start to practice that outward, and it's much easier to practice it outward because you get to see the result, whether you're talking to that person or just your own inner narrative of what happened of certain events. Try practicing it outward, and it becomes a little easier to do it inward.
I like that. Yeah. Well, it kind of falls in line with your recommendation of like, how would you treat a friend?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. All this to say, like, our inner critic, it serves us, it can help us, it's there for a reason. But become friends with it. Try to be kind to yourself, be nicer to yourself. And it's fascinating to me how the inner critic always is like, here I go again when we do or about to do something negative, but it never says, here I go again when we do something positive. Right. And it's like, that's another thing. It's like, here I go again, going for a walk. Nice. Here I go again, choosing fruit over something. Here I go again, I'm thanking someone. Like there's a million, like we don't do that, but it's interesting when you practice that, you appreciate it, you become friends with it. I love the here I go again, because I think for a lot of people, it's that voice. It's like they intend to not eat after dinner one night, then they eat after dinner, then it's here I go again, and they ate whatever it was, but then it's the whole judgment, the whole self-talk afterward that puts them on a downward spiral.
Right.
And that's, to your point, what we want to be careful of is that, that second thought. And just, maybe one of the easier ways to practice more self-compassion, and these all go hand in hand, is to separate facts from fiction. Like the fact is, let's say you ate after dinner. The fiction is everything else you're telling yourself. That's your own personal narrative. That's your own story you're telling yourself. Focus on the facts. You ate. All right, big deal. Next, we move on.
Right. Right. sort of that idea of like, remember when you were a kid and people told you not to swallow the watermelon seeds for fear of growing a watermelon in your stomach? Like, what? Right? Like, I think to your point, when we crack open the story and we're like, well, wait a minute, that just because I ate after dinner doesn't make me an evil human being.
Right. Right.
Right. So crack open those stories for sure. For sure.
I love it. Good stuff.
All right. I guess that's it for today, right?
Be kind.
That's enough.
Be kind to yourself and separate yourself from yourself. Remember, you want to enjoy the waves, appreciate the waves, but you don't want to be the waves ideally.
I like it. All right, guys. Well, let us know if you have any thoughts in the comments below. Email Adam. He always loves to hear from you, and we'll see you next time.